Got a friend who's stuck on Gitrog? Here are 8 new decks to help them break their addiction. Hello everyone, and welcome to the Playing with Power podcast, where we talk about all things cEDH, EDH, and Magic the Gathering. I am your host, Ryan.
And I'm your host, Ian. And this week we're talking about decks for new players. Talking about what decks we suggest for new players to get started in the cEDH format.
Yep, and before we go any further, just want to talk quickly about our sponsors. That is TCG Player, that is Dragon Shield, and that is you, our listeners and viewers out there, with your support over on Patreon. So whenever you're buying product, make sure you buy them from the TCG Player links in the description below. It doesn't cost you any extra money. We get support from doing that, and you also get really good cards at great prices, and you still support local game stores in the process. When you receive it, make sure you put it in Dragon Shield product. We've always stood behind them, even before they became our sponsors. We absolutely love Dragon Shield through and through, and we will always recommend them no matter what. Also, this content comes from the support of viewers like you over on Patreon. We have all kinds of benefits for our patron, including Patreon meetup days, Discord access, entry into our webcam tournaments and leagues, and so on and so forth. We have a whole host of others as well, so be sure to check out Patreon and see if there's a tier that fits for you.
And speaking of patrons, we're going to shout out a patron today, Dennis Collins III. Thank you for your patronage, and thank you for supporting this podcast and this channel.
Yes, thank you very much, Dennis. We appreciate it.
So as I mentioned, our main topic today is decks for new players. Now, of course, we can't just pull these out of nowhere, right? We had to have criteria for what we're talking about today. So we're talking about some main things that help us to determine how to get a new player into cEDH and what deck should they pilot. So first of all, do you already play a deck, maybe in casual EDH, maybe it's a legendary creature you're used to playing in some other format, but do you have an association with the legendary creature that is already a cEDH known and respected commander? If you do, check out the decklist database, maybe the Brewer's Corner, and if you have a commander like that, go check it out. For example, if you have played a lot of Korvold in casual and you love sacrificing a bunch of stuff, and it's pretty easy to turn that into Dockside Treasure Storm. Examples like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So a question that I have frequently received when when people would ask me, "Hey, I'd really love to get in this format. What deck should I use?" One of the first things I always tell people is use a deck that you've already played before. We play with a lot of the commanders that the casual side of EDH already plays. And it takes a lot of those cues from that, and that's one of the criteria I usually use whenever I'm recommending a deck.
Definitely. Another one of our criteria is, does the deck have a straightforward game plan? So when you're looking at decks in the format, a deck that says, I have my commander, and if I resolve another card, I win the game, that's a pretty straightforward game plan, and that's a really easy thing to understand. For example, one of the decks we're going to talk about, Najeela, has 2 cards in the deck that if you resolve those cards, you just win the game with Najeela attacks. That's the type of straightforward game plan we're talking about. However, there are other decks that exist that involve, resolving something like an ad nauseam, which then draws you a certain amount of cards. You have to balance how deep you go with the ad naus. Then you cast an Underworld Breach, and then you store them off, and then you have to try and use the resources you gain. That's not something we want to introduce to a new player because that has many, many steps to it and many points of failure.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's a folly, and maybe an unintentional folly, so not necessarily with a super negative connotation behind it, but I think it's something that happens a lot of times where somebody says, oh, yeah, this is super easy. All you do is resolve this ad naus, find these 2 cards and win. When in fact, that's really not the case. There's actually a lot more complexity that us enfranchised players take for granted when it comes to certain things, like you said, like ad naus, like cards like Gamble and stuff like that. Whoa, what am I gambling for? Or I have 3 cards in hand. Is it okay that if I find XYZ with my Gamble card? Like, there are certain nuances that we as enfranchised players take for granted that a new player wouldn't know what to do right off the top of their head. They need a little bit more experience in this end of the format before they really start getting used to it. And throwing them into the proverbial deep end of the pool immediately sometimes can create a bad experience for them. It'll make them feel stupid, or it might make them feel like, oh, this isn't for me. I don't like this type of thing. And so the fact they might end up really loving it if they were just brought in on something maybe that was a little bit more their speed and or doesn't require a ton of format knowledge in order to pilot effectively.
Exactly. And, even with something as simple as mulligans, right? Decks where you have to aggressively mulligan are much harder for new players because it's not well known that, a lot of really experienced cEDH players playing proactive decks will always go down to 5 cards if they don't see exactly what they want. And there's things like that are hard to introduce to new players. So we're avoiding decks that really have to have that deep well of knowledge. And next is, does it teach you the fundamentals of the format, right? When you're picking up a new deck, it can be really unique, have a very straightforward game plan, be pretty simple, maybe something you've already played before. But if it's the one deck in the format that operates on a completely different axis than the rest of the decks in the format, you're going to have someone who's getting really good at that one deck, but when they go to pick up anything else, they're going to hate it or be confused and be like, well, it works in this deck, why doesn't it work in the other decks? So we're looking for decks that help you to learn exactly how the common play patterns happen in cEDH.
Mm-hmm. You actually see this happen a lot of times. There is a quick aside, there's a syndrome called baby duck syndrome, and it's where somebody who it learns something or finds out one piece of something in an industry or overall standard, I'm paraphrasing a bit here, they imprint on that particular item. This happens in software engineering. This happens in all kinds of different things where you have lots of choices, where they will have disproportionate favoritism towards a particular item because it was their first exposure to it. And this happens with certain decks when somebody gets into the format and that deck operates on a completely different axis. They become devotional to it, fanatical to it, and they have a lot of trouble with other ones because they don't operate on the same axes. And so they kind of fall back to old comfortable or old faithful, and it creates this kind of stunted growth because they're only really playing this one.
Yeah. And we were talking a little bit before the show. I think Gitrog is a really great example of that type of effect, where Gitrog players, they have a very particular play pattern that involves getting a discard outlet, going through really overly complicated steps and loops and things like that. Mm-hmm. And I know a lot of players and pilots who will only pilot Gitrog because that's what they know, and it really doesn't play like anything else we're doing in this format. So that's just one example of a deck like that.
Yeah, Gitrog is actually the perfect example. It's my go-to example of a perfect non-new player deck. So it's even the deck that, even if you piloted it first, it's not a deck I'd recommend you start with in cEDH. No offense to Gitrog players out there or anything like that, but your deck just operates on a different axis, and when you do that, and you try to distill it to its most basic forms, it seems easy. Cast Gitrog, find discard outlet, find Dakmor line. Everyone will scoop because you've won, And then I can't tell you the amount of Gitrog players that I have talked to that said, let me bring out the primer to actually walk through this if anybody ever asks them to walk through it. And that's not what you want from a new player experience. You don't want to have somebody tell you, well, I need you to walk me through it, and then they can't, because number one, that makes them feel bad because you kind of almost talk down to them. And number two, it puts a bad experience of the whole cEDH experience. You're like, I'm supposed to be good at this deck, and I'm not good at this deck. I'm not good at this format. I'm leaving. And then you can't also transfer into other decks. Let's say you are in Gitrog for a while, and then you realize you don't really like Gitrog, and replace Gitrog for any sort of complicated deck, not just Gitrog here. Now you try and go over to a different commander, and you're like, I don't know if I like this, or I don't know if this is what I want. And so this is the kind of things that we're just trying to avoid in general. This isn't a diss against Gitrog. This is just talking about how some of these decks aren't really new player friendly is all.
And our last criteria is, does it scale with you as a player? And this one I think is really interesting because there are decks that you can pilot where, you see a basic hand, you're like, all right, I have some lands and some counter spells and things like that. And then as you get better and you play a deck a good amount, you're like, oh, these are the things I'm looking for with this deck. All right, now I can start to say, maybe I'm mulliganing better. Maybe I'm not going to just tutor for my win condition when everyone's holding up mana. decks that reward you learning the deck and playing it more frequently and gaining the skills on those fundamentals we were just talking about, those are the kind of decks we want to suggest to new players, because the more and more one player improves and learns, the better they're going to have results with, and we want to have a deck that highlights and improves with them.
This is actually one of my favorite criteria, because when you have a deck that scales with you as a player, this is a perfect example of these level up moments you hear all the time across different spaces. Hey, I was doing X and then I finally discovered this little piece here, and now I feel like I'm an exponentially better player. If you have a deck that doesn't scale with you as a player, then you have a situation where you're, number one, not leveling up like you should be, and number two, you feel like you're outgrowing it, which kind of leads you into kind of leads you to certain conclusions maybe about the format without full experience of the different choices and options out there. Plus, at the end of the day, it just makes you feel good. I have experienced this personally myself, where it just makes you feel good when you found that extra thing that they didn't mention in a primer or something like that, or they didn't, or there was something that isn't widespread because it was common knowledge before the new player entered, and you figured it out and you executed it. You feel on top of the world even if you didn't win that game. Like, I love those experiences and I love those moments, and decks that allow you to do that are, I can't recommend them enough, quite frankly.
Yeah, most definitely. And one thing we wanted to note before we dive into this topic, we are not referencing budget on today's episode. We may even make a similar episode to this about budget decks for new players and things for upgrading. This episode will assume that you are in a place in which you can either proxy or for some reason own some of these cards. We are talking strictly from the matter of, is your play going to improve by piloting these lists? Are you going to get better as a player by piloting these lists? We're trying to keep all financial implications out of it because it's a completely separate discussion, and I think it would really just cloudy the water. And I think it would really just cloud the water for this conversation. So it's something we're going to have a separate conversation about, but note that we are once again not talking about budget today, because we're going to be talking about things like 3, 4, 5 color decks, and they can get up there price wise. Most definitely.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's not that budget isn't important, and we're not trying to trivialize budget. We know that budget is important. Right. But for the sake of this conversation, we're only going to set that piece aside to make sure that we don't end up convoluting the points we're trying to get across tonight by muddying up the waters with a whole bunch of things about, well, but if XYZ budget isn't involved, you can't do this. We don't want to talk about that tonight. We'll talk about that at a different episode because that is important. We do feel it warrants talking about. Definitely. But we want to talk about the things that we just discussed.
Right. And once again, hopefully you're in a play group that can proxy and learn to, maybe hopefully through conversation, even if they're not originally open to it, destigmatize proxying, because proxying is gonna just create more players for our format. Right? The more you proxy, the better you can learn. You're not worried about losing to your budget. You're worried about losing to your mistakes, or you're worried about losing to your opponent having the nuts. But that's something different. It's not about losing to your wallet. That's not what people want to play.
Mm-hmm. That's exactly right. Okay. Well, without further ado, let's go ahead and dive into today's topic. I'm going to go ahead and start us off. So the first commander that I'm recommending for new players is Yuriko the Tiger Shadow. So Yuriko the Tiger Shadow is a classic Yuriko pivot strategy. So the deck is in Dimir colors, which means it has some of the some really good and very compact win conditions in it. Yuriko has a very straightforward game plan. Land little creatures, attack with little creatures, cheat in your commander, flip giant thing or thing with big mana cost to kill everyone. Yuriko as a cEDH strategy is almost the same as Yuriko as a casual strategy.
Definitely.
So Yuriko basically just dials some of the dials on its, dials some of its dials up to 11. That's really all Yuriko does. Yes, there's nuances, Yuriko players. Yes, there's nuances. There's nuances in every deck. Yeah. But as a very basic, if I only had one sentence to describe you type game plan for Yuriko, Yuriko's strategy is very straightforward. And this kind of checks off a lot of the boxes we just talked about. Is this a deck that a lot of players played casually? Yeah. It cheats commander tax. It's not hard to put really big cards in there and flip them off the top to drain your opponents. Like,
also ninjas. It's just a casual appeal.
It's ninja tribal too, right?
Right.
It's so good. Like, it's still got flavor to it. It's not 98 generic cards and your commander in a soul ring or something. You know, it's like, no, we're talking like there's flavor in it. There's personality in it. It's fun. It's a fun deck to pilot. It is not... It's not boring on any level. There's just something about manipulating the top of your deck and then be like, Blink Moth Infusion, gotcha! You're just like, that's so painful. You know? It definitely teaches you the fundamentals of the format because Dimir as a color pairing in our format is critical.
Really strong.
Yeah, learning different key interactions, when to counter something, when not to counter something. As a Yuriko pilot, you're going to lose some games because you didn't counter the right thing at the right time. But that's how you grow. And Yuriko is going to help teach you that. Yuriko is going to help teach you about card velocity. And card velocity is how many cards you see throughout a game. And it's going to teach you that because you're always manipulating your top deck and you're always going to have to make a choice about what the best card's going to be.
Yeah. As
you first start as a Yuriko player, you're going to just, that's the most expensive spell. It goes on top. I drain you guys for 5. Whereas as you grow as a Yuriko player, you're saying, my seat position's here, and I know this guy or this person has got XYZ because I saw them tutor. I'm going to not choose that one as the top. I'm going to choose it second from the top or something. Flip to something that maybe has a lower CMC, but I get it into my hand so I can stop their plan next turn. Exactly. Yuriko lets you kind of grow in that aspect.
Yeah, and there's a lot of subtleties to playing Yuriko, but I think the most important point you brought up there is it is probably so if we're looking at like how does it scale on our criteria that we mentioned, the do you already play the deck criteria, this is the one that I think is like maxed out in this category because as you mentioned, it translates so easily to how people play it in casual. And there are many decks that people can say like, oh, well, I definitely played like a similar game plan and stuff like that. But this one is so clear cut of like, you still want to do the gimmicky, fun stuff in Yuriko, the cEDH deck. You just got to make it as lean and efficient as possible. And then you get to do some really broken stuff on top of that. So it's one of those decks that I could easily see people accidentally making cEDH all the time. Just because it's one of those things where you're just like, okay, they optimized it a little bit. Oh, they optimized it a little bit. And now 2 years later, you're like, this is just cEDH Yuriko. What are you doing?
We've had this exact issue happen in our play group where we had the proverbial arms race that happened, as it happens in many a play group. And our team member Mike, he brought a Yuriko deck, and no joke, I think we like looked at his deck afterwards because we're not playing cEDH right now. Why are you running Fierce Guardianship in this deck right now, man? He's like, it's really good with the commander, man. We looked at his deck. He was 3 cards off the database. He was 3 cards different, and I was like, oh wow, okay, Mike, you need to bring something else first of all. But it's just like you said. It was the perfect example of a lot of people are probably already piloting cEDH Yuriko. They just don't know it. They just have to remove their like 3 cute cards,
spice cards.
Their spice cards. They're individual. Yeah. So that's absolutely funny. That's why I definitely recommend Yuriko.
Yeah, it's a great point. And it's just a deck that's naturally designed to be lean to the ground, right? You're casting a commander that is really hard to get rid of permanently. You're keeping your really efficient threats on the battlefield. You're building in innate synergy. Like, it's just a very easy deck to make good. And it's playing blue-black, so you get to play Thoracle Consult and ta-da!
Yeah, sometimes you're just going to draw into that. Yeah. You know? Like, you're just going to draw into Thoracle Consult. By the way, those are the 3 cards Mike didn't have. and you're just going to sometimes you're just going to get there with that, which is great. Yeah. That's great to have that. But it also teach you about timing. Yep. You know, when to go for that versus a secondary game plan. Yep. It scales with you so well as a player. And that's one of the things I love about Yuriko. I could give somebody a Yuriko deck today at a cEDH table and like let them sit there all night, and I almost guarantee you they would walk away with at least 1 win.
Yeah.
You know,
It's definitely a deck
that's how
yeah.
great Yuriko is. Yeah.
It's a deck that I've seen new players come to tournaments and perform well with.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Because they're like, hey, yeah, I get it. The thing does the thing. And you're like, yeah, you're not wrong.
And it does it really well.
Yes, really clean, really efficient. Awesome. Yep. So now we're going to talk about my first commander, which, like, I don't think this is going to surprise anybody. I feel like it's one of those decks that is just, it's super straightforward. If Yuriko is the upgrade path maxed out category, this might be the straightforward deck maxed out category. We're talking about Najeela the Blade Blossom. It's, in my opinion, probably the best deck for new players. The one hitch, I think, for this deck is that you have to occasionally worry about what color of mana your lands are producing. Mm-hmm. If you're playing the mid-range version of Najeela, it's even easier to teach new players. The current Warrior Queen primer is doing some stuff with ad nauseum, and that's definitely a complicated point for the deck. But if you're talking about like mid-range Najeela featuring like one copy of Deafening Silence, featuring a Toski, Bearer of Secrets, and maybe even a Collector Roof, that is such a straightforward game plan, because the whole point is you want to get down your Najeela, probably on turn 2 after playing a turn 1 Dork, and then you just tempo out. And the tempo term is definitely diluted because in cEDH it's really hard to describe tempo, but a lot of the times the best way to play that deck is to resolve a Najeela, answer one or two things, and then go, Nature's Will? Did I get there?
Let's shuffle.
Yeah.
You know?
And it has a great backup plan of, I'm going to beat you to death. And you don't even need your win cons to win with Najeela. Sometimes, legitimately, even the best Najeela pilots will say, yeah, sometimes the best play right now is swing with Najeela and activate the ability for 5 mana and then do it again. Sometimes that's just a win con. It's a very straightforward deck. You play Najeela, you use Najeela. You hope there's not a perfect like board full of blockers. And it's a really strong deck. It has the pivot plan of going into Thassa's Oracle Demonic Consultation, so it's teaching you things that are common in this format, being like, that's a iconic win condition. It gives you access to all 5 colors, which is not only teaching you like the fundamentals of the format, how to deal with all of the colors in the game, but it's also teaching you to scale, right? You are scaling, and your play, the tighter and tighter your play gets, Najeela rewards that extremely, extremely well. If you know what spells to interact with, when to go for your win conditions, when to wait on your win conditions, whether you need to have Najeela swing for another turn before you play your Derevi, maybe, you know, not letting the table know you're going to win next turn, stuff like that. Those little nuances in your game are really, really rewarded with Najeela. And as we said, access to all 5 colors, access to a cheap commander that comes out early and is your game plan. It's a super clean deck.
I have described many times in the past that I think Najeela is the most powerful commander in our format. And the reason is a lot of the reasons you just said. You know, it just rewards you for just casting the commander. You could hand, like I gave with the Yuriko example earlier, you could hand somebody a Najeela deck, and they would probably walk away with at least 1 win.
Yep.
Najeela is fantastic at that. One of the things that's also great about Najeela, in my opinion, is that Najeela is so good that it's hard to build her wrong. Is the best way I can describe it.
Yeah.
Like, she's hard to build badly. She can pivot on so many different axes in a playstyle that you prefer. Like you said, we have, you know, Warrior Queen, which is a, you know, proactive plan. Let's get Najeela. Let's maybe do an ad nauseum thing too. But then you have like your mid-range plans. There are stacks builds of Najeela out there that aren't just on Deafening Silence, but are like, hey, let's lock down the board and win with combat, almost Winota style. You know, and they're putting in numbers. Yeah. So that's a great thing about Najeela too. It's not just like, well, I don't want to win this way. Be like, no, don't worry. Najeela can also play the way you like to play too.
Yeah, exactly.
Some of the nuances that's great about Najeela, in my opinion, on top of that, is Najeela will teach you things as far as scaling as a player goes that you a lot of times don't even know in regular EDH. Like there was a lot of level up moments for me from Najeela, even sitting across from it. I would see people like block and, like decide blocks and how you decide attacks and things like that. Those nuances about trading resources is actually really, really important pieces of Magic that people don't think about. Like, oh, I'll just absolutely throw my Tymna in front of this. And, and sometimes people are like, well, why was that good? Why was that bad? A lot of times people won't give it a second thought. But when you're piloting Najeela, you understand a little bit more nuance what tempo means. And Najeela teaches you that.
Yeah. It also, there's a lot of really unique intricacies and I think Pongo mentioned this when you guys did the Mind Sculptors episode about the best decks in the format, where it's very interesting that Najeela is the one deck in the format that also taps into your limited skills. So this kind of goes into your scaling as a player thing. So if you understand the nuances of attacking and blocking on a really deep level, you'll understand things like, for example, if you're playing Najeela and you need to get an attack in to generate more warriors, and you have an opponent who's on Kinnan with Kinnan on the field, the odds of them trading a Kinnan, their main game plan, for your Najeela, your main game plan, are quite low. Yeah, they'll probably block one of your warriors, but if you need to get in with your commander, that's probably going to happen in those circumstances. So really looking around the table and understanding what you can and can't get away with as far as attacking in the format, that's one of the things that allows you to scale really well with that deck. Now, I will say it allows you to scale in a way that isn't relevant for a lot of decks in the format, but it's still something that as your play increases, as you get better as a player, you will have better results with that deck.
Yeah, I think what you said about Kinnan and Najeela is a perfect example, because it lets you think in a way that you didn't normally think of. Because when you're thinking about attacks and blocks on a fundamental level, you're thinking, okay, well, a 2/2 that blocks a 3/2 will kill my 3/2. I can't attack with that.
Right.
But what you have to start thinking about is, okay, they have 2 mana dorks on the board. So if I attack and he blocks, or they block with the Kinnan, technically they're sacrificing 2 lands. Because all of a sudden their non-permanents or non-land permanents aren't tapping for an additional mana.
Yeah.
So you're stripping them of their commander and resources at the same time.
Yeah.
So you actually do want them to block with Kinnan sometimes in some aspects. So
definitely.
And so these are the certain levels that you start to think about when you're starting to think about attacks and blocks with Najeela that you maybe didn't think of in other times. And so I love that Najeela scales with you as a player in that aspect. But also, like, Najeela gets to run the best removal. And when you look at stock lists, you'll be like, why is that the best removal, or why is this the best removal? And then as you kind of start to see games unfold, you realize, okay, now I'm understanding why Abrupt Decay is really great. Yes, I couldn't hit Smothering Tithe in casual games with Abrupt Decay, but I could with Assassin's Trophy. But the fact that the control player has this engine that I can't shut off, and now they can't counter it, will tell me why Abrupt Decay is so good. And Najeela teaches you those types of things as well, just from the deck list itself.
Yeah, most definitely.
All right. So let's go on to my next choice, and this one should come as a surprise to absolutely nobody out there in the world. That is Godo, Bandit Warlord. Now, remember when I was talking about baby duck syndrome at the beginning of this episode, how you imprint on a certain one? Godo is the reason that I choose Godo is because there is a classic trope of Godo out there that says hurdy-dirty, count to 11 and win the game. But if you think about that, other than the fact that they just spit in the face of Godo and it makes me want to riot, what they're actually saying is all you have to do is get to 11 and win the game. Like that's about as straightforward as they come. Like, just make, and you'll even see it from players that play across the table from Godo. You see them kind of counting your board. They're like, okay, he's at 9, guys. We need to start getting ready. He's at 9 because they're counting to 11 too. So Godo is the quintessential win con in the command zone. Like if you're talking about, combo pieces and what do we look for in our commanders, literally Godo, it fetches his own half of the combo piece. And then you just pay 6, pay 5 to equip helm and win the game. So straightforward game plan ticks that box. Do you already play the deck? Not sure if you do or not, but that could apply to anything. But does it teach you the fundamentals of the format? Yes. And why does it teach you the fundamentals of the format? Because Godo teaches you when to go for it, when not to go for it. Sometimes it teaches you to be brave when normally you would be scared. Godo will say, all right, they're holding up 2 blue, but how many cards are in their hand? And they just spent 3 cards stopping the person before me from going off with Thassa's Oracle, right? What are the chances that they have another one? Let's find out. It teaches you to be brave in that aspect, and sometimes when to just go for it versus, I know that they've got it. So it teaches you the fundamentals of the format in those aspects, like when to go for a combo, when to hold back. Also, when should you switch from your proactive plan to more defensive plan? When you first start out as Godo, you are just counting to 11. So it's super easy to get into the format, get some wins, have a great time, have some laughs. But then as you play Godo more and more, you start to see things like, oh, I lost that game because I wasn't respecting seat position. I lost that game because I had this in my hand, but I decided to play a mana rock instead, and that could have stopped that person. So it does scale with you as a player a lot more than people think it does. There are times when an initial look at the primer or the deck list might make you scratch your head at some things until you see them in the wild or get a certain nuanced line that you didn't know before, or work with an interaction that you realize was really good. A classic example of that in Godo is Direfleet Daredevil. So Direfleet Daredevil is a 2/1 human pirate for 2. It's 1 and a red, and it has first strike. And a lot of people look at that and they say, why in the world is this random card in the cEDH deck? It doesn't have anything to do with equipment. It doesn't have anything to do with ramp. What exactly is it? And Direfleet Daredevil reads, whenever it enters the battlefield, exile target instant or sorcery card from an opponent's graveyard. You may cast that card this turn, and you may spend mana as though it were a mana of any type to cast that spell. And then, if it'd be put into a graveyard, you exile it instead. So this teaches you a lot about the fundamentals of the format, too. Because you say, hey, maybe a plan got disrupted, or hey, I don't have any counter magic in my hand, but somebody has a Pact of Negation over there. I will cast Direfleet Daredevil, exile their Pact of Negation, and now I have Pact of Negation backup. Or just something like Dispel. Somebody's trying to get you with a Force of Vigor or a Nature's Claim. You can cast the Dispel because you can cast the mana or a mana of any color, including your colorless, and be able to stop that plan. But you're not going to get those nuances until you play cEDH more, until you see that stuff in the wild. And that's one of the things that help you scale and learn as a player that you might not have noticed at first glance with Godo. So it's got a lot more nuance than people think it does, but it's such an easy entry into this format.
Yeah. So as far as is the game plan super clean? Mm-hmm. This is one of those, another one, maxed out category, right? Super clean game plan, play the things, maybe do some cute stuff with Goblin Welder, but apart from that, at the end of the day, you're just going get me my mana, go for it. Sometimes you're drawing the wrong piece, you grab Hammer of Nazan. That's your the really hard thinking is the slight pivot to Hammer of Nazan sometimes, right?
I had to shift from midnight to 1. I didn't.
Yeah, exactly.
I didn't have to go all the way to 6. I'm not 180ing here.
Yeah, but it's a clean deck. It's very straightforward, and it's really helpful for new players to be okay. And as you mentioned, a lot of the stuff you learn from Godo isn't from Godo. Mm-hmm. Godo doesn't teach you the fundamentals of the format as far as interaction points. It doesn't teach you the fundamentals as far as how to play blue, how to use black tutors, how to use green ramp. It doesn't teach you any of that stuff. What it does teach you is how to pay attention to the table.
Yep.
Now, you know what you're going to do, right? You're going to do your little math in your head. Sometimes you're all right, that's 4 treasonous ogre. Okay. Yeah.
But you'll have enough life, counting your finger, taking off the socks so you can count with your toes because Godo players are stupid, apparently. Ha ha ha.
Ryan, do you have some grievances you'd like to air?
Not on this episode. There's not enough time. There's not enough time in this episode.
But yeah, so it's got a very clean plan, so it allows you more space and time to worry about how to play a proactive deck in the current meta. And that's really interesting. It's a really interesting way of tackling it. And then you get to worry about things like, how do I deal with stacks that shut down my game plan, i.e. things like Drannith Magistrate, the bane of fun.
Yes.
And stuff like that. So it teaches you a lot of fundamentals, once again, about reading the table. Not your own game plan. Godo does not translate well to most other decks, but it teaches you the multiplayer aspect of the format. It teaches you to look at 1, 2, 3 other players and say, okay, I need to worry about what they're doing, and they're doing, and then go from there.
Yeah, and because Godo's plan is so straightforward, you're not spending so much time in the tank thinking about 10,000 different lines you could take with maybe something like ad nauseum. Every flip, your game plan changes.
Yeah.
You know, okay, I've got this now. Can I go get that? XYZ, and the math and the branches start going. And every time you flip, you're doing that. Okay, how much life do I have left? And you're thinking about that. Godo basically removes that for you, so you're not so focused on just trying to pilot your deck right. You know, Godo, he can take care of himself. He's good at that kind of stuff. He's self-sufficient. He's a strong, independent warlord. He don't need no pilot. But this frees you up to start seeing what other people are doing and starting to really start to focus on how much mana is untapped? Why did they leave that up? Or why are they talking that way to this other player? Like, are they trying to politic? And you're starting to pick up these things that you almost get a little bit of a radar going, or a pseudo X-ray vision going, just because you're not so worried about your game plan in the beginning. Yes, you know, like I said, it does scale, but in the beginning, you're learning about what all the other players are doing. Be like, wow, that was a big counter war. Now I'm just going to go win because the turn was passed to me, you know? And it's just like, but you're like, wow, there was a lot of priority antics. There's a lot of politicking going on. There was all these different things that are happening. Oh, they played this over that. Why didn't they cast their commander right now? I bet they have something to stop me.
Right.
You know, like the mana is clearly there. Why wouldn't they want to progress their game plan? Oh, because now they pivoted to defense stance because they want to stop me. Maybe I shouldn't go for it. And you got to learn a couple of times by losing a few games to see those. And Godo teaches you that very well. And I would even abstract that into just, you know, straightforward game plans in general. Like, you extrapolate that out of Godo. It's just a really good tip to know. Like, when you get your game plan down very well in cEDH, you start to pay attention to what other people are doing, and it's a really good level up moment.
Right. Two points I want to make. Godo is a great thing for new players, especially because you're never going to, with some of these decks that we talk about today, you're never going to counter the wrong spell with Godo, right? Because you're not worried about stack interaction, things like that. Yeah, sometimes you might red blast the wrong Rhystic Study or whatever. But 9 times out of 10, Godo isn't the interaction deck. There are options in Godo because, you know, you're a responsible player, but it doesn't mean it's the deck that wants to do that and focus solely on doing that. So that takes a certain burden off of a new player, which is really nice. And as far as scaling, something else to mention with that is Godo teaches you how to scale, as far as scaling how to mulligan in an aggressive, proactive deck. The many, many good Godo pilots I know are absolutely insane when it comes to mulligans. I know, like, Azrael goes to like 3 or 4 every single game because, you know, sometimes you treason this ogre and it doesn't matter what you've done apart from that, right? And that's definitely an extreme example, but it teaches you that, like, proactively you can dig to leverage your advantage of speed.
Yep. And it also teaches you in ways to be better deck builders too, if that is a route that you ever want to take. A lot of people get attracted to Commander from a brewing aspect. There's not a whole lot of net decks out there for casual Commander, if you think about it. You have like EDH rec that you know says, here's some cards that you can work with. Yeah, options, but not decisions. Like, they don't say, here's 100 cards, go play it. Like, that's actually super uncommon. You know, everyone wants to express themselves in their decks, and they do that through deck building. So when we get to this end of the format and all the decks are kind of put together, you know, you lack a certain degree of growth when you're only ever net decking. And Godo teaches you in that aspect about how to make your cards the best they can be and how to make the the routes to victory as compact as possible, which allows you to say, I'm going to go to 5 and not feel bad about it.
Yeah, exactly.
I would rather, because it is not hard for Godo and decks in those types of realms to go to things like 5. Yes, I have seen Godo players go to 3 and win. I've seen them go to 4 and win, because Godo is also built in such a way that you can do that. And also just, in general, the mono red concept, understanding your weaknesses, trying to shore those up, knowing how to do other things to shore up those weaknesses. Like you said, it's not the stack interaction deck. So whenever somebody says, do you have anything for it, Godo? You just say, I'm Godo. I don't know what you're talking about. Pass priority. Even though you have a Tybalt's Trickery and 2 untapped lands.
Yeah, exactly. Because
you can absolutely interact on the stack with Godo. You're just going to interact with the things that you care about.
Yeah.
Not the things that the rest of the table cares about. If I'm going to lose because, Demonic Consultation's on the stack, sure, I'll counter it with, my Tybalt's Trickery. But unless a stacks piece comes down that's going to stop me, I don't care. Let somebody else fight over it.
Yeah. Sweet. All right. Now, Brian, we can take our Godo off the podium, and you can still cuddle it, but we're going to move on.
I can talk about this all night. We need to, I just need to get it out of my system and create an entire Godo episode and have 10 people listen to it, and I don't care. It's worth
and I'll get a cutout of myself, and I'll put it here because you will not need me.
Exactly. That's so true. Oh, God.
I'll have a string, and every once in a while when I hear you pause, it'll be like, great point, Ryan.
It's just a recording. That's a good point, Ryan. What else do you have to say? Oh, thank you for asking, Ian.
Oh, man. All right, so we're going to pivot from one of Ryan's babies to one of my babies, that being Dawnwaker Thrasios. Now, this may come as a surprise to people that I pitched this as a great deck for new players, but I stick by this decision pretty heartily. So, why am I pitching Dawnwaker Thrasios today? One thing to note about the deck, it's not playing black, right? So you don't learn that side of the format as far as that is concerned. However, there is already a certain amount of reprieve pressure-wise at the table that you are going to feel from not playing black in your mid-range deck. Your life total is never going to be the one that the table is going to actively pressure, because one, it's a Thrasios Bruce deck, there's no black in it, and two, Bruce Tarl tends to say, yeah, okay, thanks for attacking me, can we please attack someone else at this point, because I'm just going to gain this all back.
I'm going to waste this interaction, is essentially what it's saying. Yeah,
exactly. So do you already play the deck? I don't think this is a deck that gets scaled a lot. I think a lot of partner combos are not often scaled up from casual commander. Partners are pretty, I don't want to say exclusive to cEDH, but unless they have a certain gimmick to them, they're not often played a ton in casual.
Yeah, they're not super prevalent in the casual side.
Right. So does it have a straightforward game plan? This is where I think the deck really exceeds. So a lot of the game plan of that deck is play a couple mana dorks, sometimes you activate Thrasios, and then you have super extreme clean win conditions. The deck is a lot of A plus B, make infinite mana, you have your commander, you win the game. There's Dockside and Meal combos, there's occasionally other Dockside combos, depending on what flavor of the deck I'm filling for the month. There's usually a non-artifact combo, so for right now it's like Emil, Derevi, Cradle, still relatively simple. A lot of this stuff layers on top of each other. The namesake of this deck being the Dawnwaker combos, being Zerta the Dawnwaker and either Grim or Basalt Monolith, which also works with the layering of Kinnan and Basalt Monolith. All of these combos layer on top of each other, and the result is super simple, which is I'm going to make infinite mana and draw my whole deck. Now, occasionally, with decks that are win-conless, draw my whole deck doesn't usually work, and doesn't always get translated for new players well. However, Dawnwaker's playing Finale of Devastation, which is a very easy way to explain to new players. You do a finale for $1 million after you play all your creatures, and you get them dead. And that's a really easy way to talk about it. There's other lines on top of that too. Right now, the other main win condition is using Emil, Eternal Witness, and a Lightning Bolt, which is not the hardest combination to tell people, because you go, you flicker it, you get your lightning bolt back, you cast it to somebody, you do it again, you do it again, you do it again. Those are really simple lines to go through and not hard for new players to get around. So infinite mana, I win the game, is something that you can say there. So it's like what we were talking about earlier with the whole Gitrog, like discard outlet Gitrog land, except for at the end of the day, you can explain how it actually wins a lot easier. You say, I'm going to draw my stuff, going to play some mana rocks, going to go for big finale. If for some reason finale's gone, instead I'm going to do this lightning bolt thing. Very, very simple lines. Now, if you get past those first two win cons, things can get a little more complicated, but I hope it doesn't often get that way. So as far as that is concerned. And then as far as, does it teach you the fundamentals of the format? Yeah, it teaches you what a green mid-range deck looks like in this format. It teaches you Thrasios, which is one of the premier partners in this format. It's a grindy Thrasios deck. You know, you go get your Seedborn Muse at some point. It's a very clean explanation for, like, why do you play Bruce Tarl? Because you Neoform or Eldritch Evolution it into a Seedborn Muse. And then sometimes you make up for your Sylvan Library. But it's a very, like, all of the steps of, like, why things are important in the deck, they're very simple explanations. You know what I mean? Zerda and the Monoliths. Monoliths make infinite mana. Kinnan Monolith makes infinite mana. All these things are very clean lines. Dockside, play a meal, make infinite mana. And I've taught a lot of new players. Back when the cEDH decklist database was doing recommendations, I was very, very insistent that this deck was considered a recommended deck because I had a lot of new players attracted to it because of how just clean it was. It definitely has a certain level of, like, a synergistic feel to it. It feels like very much like, oh, I can wrap my head around. I have my commander, I make infinite mana. It's very easy. It's something easy to grasp, and it really, really, really scales with you as a player. The subtleties of, you know, how you can still do really well with Thrasios and a Seedborn Muse, but when you start to understand the subtleties of a Thrasios and a Seedborn Muse, for example, I'm at the point now where I can go around the table in like a third of the time it used to take me, where you go scribe bottom flip card, all right, scribe bottom flip card, all right, scribe bottom flip card, let's go. And it scales with you really well as a player. You can learn how to achieve these combos much more easily. You can learn how, you know, there are many different packages that have been swapped in and out of the deck, and I have a lot of new players either because of budget or because they prefer one thing. For example, Vertov just top 4 the Commander's Vault tournament, playing a version that just plays the freed from the real combos with the rest of the deck. A very easy package to swap in and out, because guess what? It's A plus B make infinite mana. It's a very easy thing to just kind of like work into this deck. It plays a really good amount of interaction. It plays a solid amount of mana dorks, teaching you sort of the fundamentals of what a consistent deck looks like in that sense. And through those pieces, you really get an understanding of like, okay, this is a consistent list. It does its thing. It eventually tries to like answer one or two threats, and then it's a little more proactive than, say, some of the slower Seedborn Muse lists. Instead, it is just looking to assemble infinite mana combo, play the commander, and win the game. Very clean, very simple, and it does scale pretty well.
When I first looked at Dawnwaker Thrasios as some of your recommendations, I did scratch my head a little bit, and I was like, well, you know, 4-color partners, Sans Black, is this really a new player deck? And then as I kind of thought about it, it really is. And the reason that it is, in my opinion, is it's doing a lot of the stuff that high-powered EDH already does. Mm-hmm. You know, it's doing the things that a lot of casual EDH already does. It is playing ramp. Every deck running green plays ramp. You know, some people play dorks, some people play, you know, cultivates. But like this ramps, you know, you trade your resources in for advantage with Thrasios. It does the really cool thing, the very easy to understand A plus B. Oh, I found A. Now I need to go search for B, or hey, I found B by just drawing into it with Thrasios. And that stuff is really easy for people to understand, like, because it isn't that big a leap from casual over to competitive. Whenever I try to describe Finale of Devastation to a casual player or a player coming over into cEDH space, I'm saying this isn't Finale of Devastation. This is Craterhoof Behemoth.
Yeah,
that's what this is. You know, so just cast this to win the game. And they're like, oh, perfect. I've seen that a billion times in casual.
Exactly.
I cast Craterhoof and I win. And this is exactly what you do with Finale. This is your Craterhoof Behemoth. You win the game with it. They're like, oh, perfect. Thank you. You know? And when they said, they're like, and then when they kind of realize that kind of clicks in their head, they're like, oh wow, this is actually super easy. I have like 5-6 creatures and I cast it for like 100,000 because I've assembled infinite mana.
Right.
Then it's it's real easy to kind of connect the dots in these aspects. Another thing about this deck that I think is super, I don't want to say slept on, but never mentioned enough. It's a blast to pilot. It's so much fun to pilot. It's because like you're always doing something. You're like, because they look to you a lot because you always have these Thrasios activations up. And so you're always able to do something or are doing something, especially when Seedborn Muse is out because everyone groans like, oh, God, let him do his Thrasios thing now. Blah. Oh, Scry, let me think about it. Yeah, that one to the bottom. Okay. Let me do it again. In response, you're like, God, just do it, all right? Just Scry 3 times. Let's go to the turn. But it's fun. It's a fun deck to pilot. Like anybody who plays Storm, people who love Storm, it's because you're doing a lot of things, and you're doing a lot of things in Dawnwaker. And it's real easy to get hooked and get into this format by playing Dawnwaker because you're always doing so many things and you're moving so many pieces around and you're always trying to solve your puzzle and you're thinking about things. And like you said, it teaches you about when to interact with something, when to leave something back, when to go for something, when not to, how to stop it. And it teaches you all of these different things. And it does, I think, scale with you as a player. Because like you said, 2 lines get interrupted. You still have other things in certain outs.
Yeah.
Hey, is my Eldritch, like, when you're first thinking in one dimension, you're like, this Eldritch Evolution's a Seedborn Muse. You don't think about it as anything else. Yeah. Until you reach situations where it does scale with you as a player, you're like, oh, okay, this is my Vexing Shusher because I'm playing against a control player. Right. This dork into a Vexing Shusher, and now my stuff starts to resolve. Things like that are the things that I think help you scale as a player with this deck.
Definitely.
All right, so the next one that I wanted to talk about was Anje Madness. Now, this one at first glance might seem like something that you're like, well, why Anje Madness for a new player deck? And there's a couple of different reasons why Anje Madness I have selected for that. First of all, Anje is played in a lot of casual. So I think when somebody's trying to go over to cEDH, if they have something like Anje's kind of seen, throughout the casual spaces. It's not the number one deck, of course, but it does things in a way that isn't just, A plus B equals C, and that's how you win the game. It has that do a lot of stuff to it. So Anje Falkenrath is a Madness deck where you don't have 100 cards, you actually only have like 40 cards. Because you pack your deck full of Madness cards that allows you to rummage and dig super deep into Anje. Yep. So the game plan is actually straightforward, and she can win very quickly. You basically go find your World Gorger Dragon combo. And some new players are like, I don't understand how the World Gorger Dragon combo works, but you give them like 45 seconds of description. You say, look, go cast Animate Dead after World Gorger Dragons in your graveyard, and you win the game. They're like, oh, okay, great. And it's super easy and super compact to assemble that combo. Anje enables it. And there is certain things that allow you to scale with Anje as well. Because the Madness cards, when you first start with Anje, are dead cards. You don't think about them as anything else than, this is a card to discard to keep going with Anje to find my World Gorger Dragon. But those Madness cards actually do have relevant abilities on them. So Anje does allow you to scale as a player when you're saying, well, I can use Psychotic Episode here. Or I can use Biting Rain because I have Najeela. I'm staring down a ton of Najeela warriors. I'll use Biting Rain and wipe their board. These little things that you don't think about initially that you do start to think about with Anje. So I will concede that the World Gorger Dragon is complicated a little bit in the beginning, and it can be easily disrupted, but that's like anything in our format. You can disrupt all kinds of stuff in our format. So a lot of people already play it. It's fun because you're always doing something. You're always tapping on you, untapping on you. I'm discarding, I'm finding, I'm looking, I'm rummaging, and I'm doing all these different things. And you get that feeling kind of like in the Dawnwaker thing. I'm always doing something. I'm always activating Thrasios, and I'm moving all my pieces around a lot. It's a lot of fun in that aspect.
Yeah.
It's in 2 colors, so you're not worrying about 5 colors and what about this? What about that? What about XYZ? Should this interaction be for this meta? You're in a lot more limited colors, which in a lot of aspects is very good for new players, because if you let the gates wide open, there are times when they can get overwhelmed, and it's not necessarily something you have to worry about with Anje. Does it teach you the fundamentals of the format? I think it does, because this is, once again, kind of like that Godo thing. You need to know when to go for it. You need to know when you have to watch out for, when you need to hold back. You have to understand when's the right time to execute certain game plans. Anje is a really great way to understand how to take different paths to victory.
Yeah.
Anje uses a lot of her madness cards to win the game.
Right.
Like, it's not just, I'll fireball you. It's other things. So if something gets disrupted or countered or something like that happens, you can find another path. And some of those paths get a little intricate, a lot more intricate than I think a lot of people on the outside looking in at Anje realize.
Yeah.
And it has a lot of the classic staples that you see in red and black. You see all the tutors. You also see Dockside as a shock to no one. And there's also Dockside loops inside of Anje as well. So this teaches you about how to use use pieces for more than one intention. Dockside isn't just a ramp piece. It can also be a combo piece, kind of like with Dawnwaker. So Anje, I think, is one of those things that does, straightforward game plan, get World Gorger in, does allow you to grow, and all those different types of things.
Yeah, and this is another one that I sort of, ironically, I think we had back-to-back where you looked at it and I was like, really? And then I thought about it with Anje especially. This is another one. Do you already play the deck? Scaled out to the max, because Anje Madness, you literally add, like, some mana rocks and a combo piece, and that's the casual deck that just fully optimized and made better to have a win condition.
Yeah, you're probably swapping about 10 cards to get a full madness for a full cEDH.
Yeah, I would definitely say so. And I was thinking about it as you were speaking, and I was like, I actually know a good amount of players who started on Anje Madness for this very reason. They got the pre-con. They were like, oh, I can swap out a couple of these cards, and then I can start playing cEDH with you guys. And I was like, 100%. That is 100% something valid to do. As far as scaling notes with this deck, it's really interesting. There's actually a list out right now called Bad Anje, B-A-D being, I believe, Breach, Ad Nauseam, Dockside. So you can then take a couple of the more synergistic pieces out and then start upgrading this as you get better as a player. Maybe pivot to a list like Bad Anje and start looking into the Breach, Ad Nauseam, Dockside things that are so pervasive in the format right now. So when you're starting out, maybe only worry about getting that World Gorger Dragon version of the list and keeping it super clean. But as you upgrade as a player, maybe look into the more intricate versions of the deck that will allow you to reflect some of the stuff from the meta. So that's a really cool thing about that. It definitely lacks a little bit in the fundamentals of the format part, I will say. But as Ryan mentioned, we were talking about with Godo, it's definitely teaching you how to play a proactive list in the current meta. And it teaches you a lot of skill, timing, things like that. Definitely one of those things, as again, you're not going to learn when to counter a spell. You're not going to learn how to interact with the table a lot of the time. And you're also going to have a lot of cards that you will literally never, ever use again. That being said, though, it also teaches you how to think on your feet. As Ryan was mentioning, sometimes you do want to cast your biting reins. And sometimes the board, unlike a lot of Adnaz decks, is stalled out. So you can play your bad madness creatures that just happen to actually win the game in a fair way if you're stacked out. So there's a lot of really cool intricacies of that deck that I think are worth bringing up as a new player. And really, it's one of those things, maybe you buy the pre-con, swap out a couple pieces at a time, start, proxying out the pieces that you're missing, and then start making them real over time. And suddenly you've got a real cEDH deck before you know it.
Yep. I think that's actually a really great point that I didn't even bring up, was the idea that you can take a precon that is still like $40, by the way. This isn't one of those ones that went to like $200. You can take Anje, go buy it on TCG Player like right now for like $40 and swap out 20 cards and you're playing cEDH. It's not that long trudge of building this commander deck and find this, find that, do this, do that, get these, get those, go to 5 different game stores or order and wait for months for it to arrive. Like the path to actually sit down and actually play is not a long one with Anje. And so as far as accessibility is concerned, this is really great. Like, I don't want to get into the nuance, of course, of price, but that is something that not a lot of other decks can really say. Like, even, I can't say that even with Yuriko. Like, there have been so many swaps in Yuriko, you're pretty much only taking the commander at this point and maybe 1 or 2 cards. Really, the rest of it is just completely different. Anje has a lot of madness in it. That's obviously what the theme of the deck was. So you already have like half to 60% of a deck, a cEDH deck, already sitting in front of you. That's a huge leg up. Another thing that Anje taught me when I was piloting Anje in the very beginning, I piloted Anje when she was 4 days old. Like, I literally like cut out a piece of paper and made cEDH Anje. Like, I piloted her when she was 4 days old. She taught me a lot about looking at cards at more than just their face value. I can't tell you the amount of times people, the level up moment for them is when they realize they can bounce their own stuff with a bounce spell.
Oh yeah, when people realize
they think of it. Yeah,
Chain
like
of Vapor is a ritual. That is like
Chain
one of the
of
biggest
Vapor is a ritual.
level up moments. 100%.
Yeah, exactly. And it's because they think about a card only in one aspect. Mm-hmm. They think about it, this is my removal spell, this is my ramp spell, this is my whatever spell. They don't think about it on a different axis, or they don't pivot it into a different way. And Anje really helps you do that, because the Madness cards in there, it doesn't run every single Madness cards. There are real ones where it actually has real value to it. I once prevented a player from going off with Curse of Fool's Wisdom. And you might be saying, what's this card? and there's a reason that Curse of Fool's Wisdom is in there, other than to just, discard to on. You're like, what is Curse of Fool's Wisdom? A Curse of Fool's Wisdom is a curse that you enchant a player, and it says, whenever an enchanted player draws a card, they lose 2 life and you gain 2 life. They can't draw their deck anymore. So thinking about these things on more than one axis is actually really good to help you grow as a player. Are you going to use Curse of Fool's Wisdom in literally any other deck? No. But it does teach you to look at your Chain of Vapor differently. It does teach you to read certain things in a different way.
Yeah.
And those are some of the skills that I took away from Anje. Mm-hmm. And I suddenly realized how much better I was piloting the 4 and 5 color decks out there, because all of a sudden I was looking at my snap in a different way. Yeah. I was looking at my removal in a different way. I was looking at some cards in completely different ways that weren't even things like removal. Yeah. And these are the types of things that Anje definitely teaches you. And like you said, Anje does graduate into more complex things when you get in, when you want to move away from just World Gorger Anje and move into bad Anje. Yeah. Like it's Breach Adnaz Anje. Yeah. But you want to move into those particular plans, Anje allows you to do that as well.
Yeah. And it also, speaking of that Curse of Fool's Wisdom, if you're a Dawnwaker player, you're making infinite mana, someone you get stopped by that Curse of Fool's Wisdom, and Anje can do those things because of the way Madness works. It breaks timing restrictions, so it's another thing like that. It teaches you how to play at instant speed. So new players with Anje, I've seen it before. They try and do the Anje tap thing during their main phase, and you're like, no. Yeah, maybe there's times where it comes up. That. Yeah. But absolutely. A lot of the time, there's some really good circumstances where if you wait, suddenly you're like, all right, draw a discard, pitch World Gorger, next turn I untap and win the game. Mm-hmm. And your opponents have no idea that's happening. Little level up moments like that are definitely relevant in that deck.
Yeah, Anje definitely does allow for those level up moments because it does teach you extra nuance of the game. There are people that say, why are you running Necropotence? If you discard a card, you exile it. Why would you ever do that? You're like, that's because of the way that Madness works, you discard it to exile, and then if you don't, you put it in the graveyard. That's not actually discarding. It doesn't trigger Necropotence.
Right.
So once again, looking at cards from New Frames, understanding different aspects of the game that you didn't once see. Anja teaches you a lot of that stuff, a lot more than I think people think that they do.
So our next pick is one that both Ryan and I both independently thought of for today, and that's Kinnan Bonder Prodigy. Now, Kinnan is a really clean deck. It's another deck that I think has the potential to be brought up from the casual side of the format. It's one of those decks that I know when it was printed, a lot of people were like, oh man, my friends keep playing this in our casual pods and it keeps just like absolutely obliterating us. And meanwhile, they're playing things like Woodland Bellower and Terastodon and things like that. And it's definitely not the same deck. But you can see a natural optimization, a natural upgrade path. And there's even versions like that on the database right now, or at least in the Brewer's Corner, which is Hire's mid-power list. It's literally called mid-power.
Yep.
Yeah. And the whole point is just to drop big fatties at a ridiculous rate because you can do that. So there's that version of the deck. Now, if you're playing that version of the deck, you definitely get a little bit less of the fundamentals of the format side of the deck.
Yeah.
However, you do get the easy upgrade path from a casual deck. It's a very straightforward game plan. Now, the I guess standard version, although the explanation of how Mirage Mirror works is a little complicated.
Yep.
If you take a couple minutes to really like look at it, it looks more complicated than it is. If you figure out the pattern to it, it's really simple. You just make a copy of the land, make a copy of Mirage Mirror, or Monolith, and mirror Monolith, etc., etc. It's actually a lot less complicated than it looks. So that game plan is pretty easy. The idea that you're just flipping into something like a Thrasios to draw your deck, also pretty simple. Same thing there, where they're playing things like Finale to like actually close out the game. Some Kinnan lists are win con lists, something to note, but most of them, I'm pretty sure, are on the Finale plan, which is, once again, very easy to explain to new players. It scales with you really well as a player because, yes, you can have the simple things of, okay, I'm going to play some Dorks and some Mana Rocks, and I'm going to make a lot of mana. And if I have 2 tutors, or if I have 2 ways to get my pieces, I just win the game right there. And the fact that it's getting even more efficient tutors, or even more efficient pieces printed, things like Treasure Vault being printed, the new artifact from Midnight Hunt that allows you to go get a mana rock, or something with a mana ability. All of these pieces are still coming out, and Kinnan just keeps getting more and more gas. So like, it's very easy for this deck to just get to its win in a very clean, efficient way. As I mentioned, your commander's 2 mana, it comes out, it ramps you really, really fast. It's something very easy to get around. You play your commander, you get some ramp in. And as a player, you can scale better. You can start looking at those opening hands and going, yeah, I have a lot of mana here, but then I kind of fizzle. I want to work towards my game plan here, right? And those conversations are something you can start having as the deck goes on. And you start really like narrowing down, getting those lines a lot cleaner, starting to be very confident with how to explain to players in the pod how the Mirage Mirror interactions work. The tutors are really efficient in the deck. The creature lines are really efficient when you're doubling your mana all the time. You know, so things like, I don't know if the main list is on shared summons anymore, but like, you get 2 creatures. It's a very simple concept. You get a creature that gets 1 combo piece, you get a creature that gets another combo piece, and you have your little clone package that goes on with that. It's all really, really straightforward stuff, and it's pretty easy to assemble. And the main combo of the deck is you get Kinnan, and you get a Basalt Monolith, and you make infinite colorless mana, and then you got to do some pieces to turn it into not just infinite colorless, but it's not the most complicated process in the entire world, and it's a pretty easy assemblage. The game plan's really simple, like Ryan was talking about. 2 colors, super easy to get to that point, right? You have your green for your ramp and your blue, and sometimes you counter some stuff. You also scale better and teaches you the fundamentals when it comes to interacting with the table, because this is a blue deck. It does have interaction. It doesn't have the most interaction in the entire world, but it has enough so that you are actively participating in the interaction part of the table. If I was someone who was learning the format and I want to work on the progression of getting into it. Maybe I start with something like Godo. I have a really clear plan, and then I just learn what everyone around me is doing. Then maybe you move on to something like Kinnan. Maybe Kinnan's your second deck, because now you're like, okay, I'm starting to see how these tables work. I want to play something that's a little more adaptive, that will adapt to the flow of the table. I want to be able to interact with what's happening at the table, and I want it to be in this commander that's really easy to cast. I almost always have access to it, and, it's not a commander where you will ever just be dead in the water, because worst case scenario with Kinnan, you can activate Kinnan. And I mean, worst case scenario, you're in a position with like 5 or 6 mana, but we don't talk about that. You have to be in a really bad spot for that. But that's a good thing for new players, because I've played stuff like Storm decks before, where you have like a cost reducer in the command zone, and you're doing your thing, and then you just fizzle hard. If I was a new player, that would feel terrible. Mm-hmm. It would feel terrible. But with Kinnan, even in the worst case scenario where your opponents are playing really responsibly, they answer your threats, they answer all your tutors, you still have Kinnan and the ability to activate its ability and go do that stuff. So it's as you mentioned, you're still doing stuff. It is still a deck where you're doing cool stuff. It's really cool to just double your mana. Like the kind of notion of that where you're like, twice the fun, right? Like it's one of those things where you're like, it's very easy to wrap your head around, right? It's pretty simple. I know some decks are playing the Bloom Tenderlines, which are even more simple because Kinnan just makes those trivial. It's a lot of stuff like that where it's a very clean way to win the game, very efficient, and at the end of the day, like it's a really easy deck to have success with. And there's a lot of brilliant pilots out there right now that are playing Kinnan to a great deal of success. Ego Vinco, also known as Tsunami, is a player who was with me in the Mean 16 last year, and who consistently, I believe, won Summer Bloom, or at least was one of the top players in Summer Bloom, presents wins with Kinnan. Not just like a 4-color ad nauseum pile. This is Kinnan, a deck that's really clean and really efficient, and you know what your deck is going to do. It's going to present the wins in these really clean, efficient ways. And so it's a deck that does scale. And now we're saying scales to be at the top tables. So a deck that can be introduced to new players, does really cool stuff, can scale from the casual side of the format, and can teach you the fundamentals so much that it can compete at the top tables. I think that's a slam pick for this category.
This is probably, in my opinion, one of the best examples of scaling.
Yeah.
Kinnan does basically everything that you just said. It does all the things. It checks all of the boxes that we have set forward tonight.
Right.
A lot of people, when Kinnan was spoiled, was like, "That's my commander. I'm going to slam a Terastodon," because that's what they want to do. You know, they get to do that kind of. Yeah, it's fun to do that. You're like, I got you, Terastodon. And that kind of stuff is really, really neat, and it gives you that kind of fun Timmy vibe to it, and it's also has this ability to scale with you as a player. When you first pick up Kinnan, basically what you're doing is you're finding Basalt. You're going infinite with Basalt. You probably already set up Thrasios or a Prophet of Distortion that allows you to draw cards. You dump it all into that, and then you draw your deck, and then you finale, right? Yep. You do that like probably for 10, 20 games. Yeah. And that's and it's perfectly fine to do that as you're learning the format. You learn to counter this or to protect that, and then but then it grows with you as a player. Now when you're activating your Kinnan, you have a couple of choices, and now you're deciding based upon your table and where your board position is, what creature you're going to put onto the battlefield.
Right.
It's not just find the biggest one and throw it on there. There's not always the best time to put a Tidespout Tyrant onto the battlefield. That's not always the best choice. Yeah. There's times when you get that clutch Gilded Drake and steal somebody's win con. These are the types of things that allow you to scale as a player with Kinnan. And like you said, this is one of those decks that allow you to, if you devote the time to it, scale all the way up to things like tournament wins. Yeah. And there's not a lot of decks that can really say that. There are some tonight that we talked about, but not all of them. Not all of them have taken home trophies and stuff like that. But they are good for new players and just playing at the tables. Kinnan is one of those decks.
Yeah.
another thing about Kinnan is, like you said, you have this House of Mirror things where you use Mirage Mirror. Another thing that Kinnan does is it does twister loops. Not everybody understands twister loops when you first get into this format. And the thing about Kinnan is you don't have to understand twister loops.
Yes.
You can just use Time Twister to get a new hand to 7. You know, it's not that, oh, this is the only way I can use Time Twister and stuff like that. You can, if you're not able to play with proxies, you can take Time Twister out and Kinnan still works just fine.
Oh yeah.
You know, so it's one of those things that definitely scales with you in that way as well. If you want to get into complex twister loops, you could absolutely do that.
Yeah.
But you don't have to do that in order to win with Kinnan.
Agreed. I think it's just a really, really solid option, and it's really clean in just a lot of the sense. One thing we definitely didn't say about Najeela before, it has the same scale potential that Kinnan does. Najeela is always putting up numbers, always. I feel like every time I was reporting on a tier 1 con, I was like, and there was a Najeela in here. The last PWP tournament, I was like, 2 Najeelas in here. Like, they're just everywhere. Assume there's always a Najeela. It's there.
Always at least one Najeela. Yep. She's good. She's so good.
It's a good deck.
And so the final one that I have for tonight is Kess, Dissident Mage. So Kess, Dissident Mage is the quintessential Grixis cEDH commander. She has been around since Commander 2017. So she has been around for a while. And people know how to play Kess. They know how to play against Kess. Kess can be pilled in a bunch of different ways. So as far as a new player avenue goes, not everybody wants to play mono red. Not everybody wants to play combat. You know, we've talked about, like, you know, Godo plays with combat, Yuriko plays with combat, Najeela plays with combat. You know, not everyone wants to win with combat. Some people want to play with their graveyard a bunch. Some people want to do Grixis good stuff piles. Some people want to play Storm or just play spells. They do want to interact on the stack. That's what they saw in things like videos and the table over at their LGS. And they say, I want to do that too. I think Kess is the perfect commander to do that. Kess does everything that you want Grixis good stuff to do. It allows you to work with your graveyard. It allows you to run some of the best combos in the format. You don't just have to be on an ad-nause only strategy, but you can be on an ad-nause only strategy because Kess allows you to rebound. Let's say you whip as hard as possible on ad-nause and you're like, oh, this is awful. You can discard some pieces and then get some of them back on your next turn rotation. You know, that Kess offers that ability to you. You don't have to worry about partners and what partner to cast at the right time and what the strengths and weaknesses of different partners can be. You just say, yeah, I'll cast my Kess. I'll cast Demonic Consultation twice and win. Yeah. Because that's the thing. You cast Kess.
An insane part of that deck that I feel like we don't talk about a lot is that you can go Consult for Thoracle. Oh, I have my Thoracle. I'm going to play the Thoracle and I'm going to cast Consult again.
Through Kess's ability.
You turn Consultation into a 1-card win con. You turn Tainted Pact into a 1-card win con. You turn Intuition into a 1-card win con. That's a lot of 1-card win cons for one deck.
Yeah. And so the other half of the quote-unquote 1-card win con is sitting in your command zone.
Yep.
And if nothing else, you're just playing Grixis value engines. You're playing Grixis good stuff. You're just playing some of the best cards our format has to offer in this package. Yeah. So if you're a Grixis lover, and you want to go explore the cEDH space, Kess is really good at that. People do play Kess in some of the lower powered ones. I'll be honest, I don't see her in all of them because I think she's starting to get a boogeyman kind of feel to her nowadays.
Completely agree.
So I think that nowadays in 2021 at this recording, she has a little bit more stigma than she maybe used to. Yep. So, but she did see play at casual tables because people would play her as Storm a lot of the times.
I will say in the high power space, I hear a lot about Kess because you can do a lot of like degenerate things that aren't quite cEDH, like, Kess turns. Like for a high power casual space, like that's a pretty degenerate thing that Kess does without having to go full cEDH. So if you're already in that space and you're like, oh, I have this Kess deck and I keep putting more and more powerful spells and now I'm casting Expropriate again and stuff like that, and you're like, okay, now what happens if we clean that up a little bit and then boom, it's cEDH. And I feel like for the first time historically, I'm hearing a lot more people playing in that space. I'm seeing it in LGSs. A lot of people who used to be 60-card competitors, after like competitive play is starting to get out, a lot of them are entering that high-powered space because they're like, oh, we can play Commander in a way that's a little more aggressive. And then a lot of those players just tend to end up in cEDH at some point. And I think like Kess is a good example of that, of like, I think it's really attractive to a lot of Grixis modern players, like, you know, they've been playing Death Shadow for years, or people who are playing Legacy and stuff like that. It starts as that high-powered sense, something you're like bringing out so you can get Commander, and then suddenly, boom, now you can go, okay, let's go all the way. Let's play the good stuff.
Yeah, exactly. And Kess is one of the good ways to do that. When you're picking up Kess, you're not having to learn a super intricate combo line that involves 100 pieces. Kess, she plays value and disruption till she can get to her very, very compact win conditions and just wins the game. So there's not a whole lot of ramp up involved with learning how to pilot Kess. You know, you say, oh, I want to cast that thing from our graveyard again. Oh, cast and do it. And so there's a lot of allure there from, like you said, a lot of the people that played in these competitive formats, you know, like Standard, Modern, and Legacy and things like that, are looking for a place in a space to play in Commander. And all the casual, you know, a lot of the casual tables that are just playing Battle Cruise are staring their nose down at you because you want to play, you know, Splinter Twin or something like that because you played it in Modern. You don't have that problem in the higher power in the cEDH spaces. And so, you know, it's a lot more welcoming. Absolutely, bring your 2 cards. Yes, absolutely, bring out your blowout crazy cards or your infinite turns or your whatever. They're welcome here. And I think that that's really great. It gives them a new home. You know, I think that's wonderful. So, you know, from a Kess perspective, you know, if you want to get into cEDH and you want to, you know, just use Grixis and use some of the best cards and play on the stack a lot, I think Kess is a really good choice for that.
Yeah, it's hard to just like argue that Kess is just a really strong deck, right? It's just really efficient at what it does. You get to play some broken spells, and then when you're done with those broken spells, you get to cast them again. Like it's some powerful stuff, and it's a really good way to like just get you into the format. If you already feel like sort of that like medium competency player, you're like, I don't know about cEDH specifically, but I feel like I'm a pretty decent Magic player. Kess feels like a pretty good place to jump in because you're taking on a bit more of a challenge with a 3-color space. You have your consultation as kinda your win cons. You're starting to learn about the win cons of the format, like Breach and Ad Nauseam and things like that, but without having to go so hard into them. You know, Kess is one of those decks that you can keep Talisman, Counterspell, Tutor.
That's
because
right.
You then can go like, all right, I'm gonna maybe play my cantrip, hold up mana round 1 or turn 1, play a mana rock, hold up some mana, and then eventually you play an impactful spell. Next turn you get your Kess out, play some more impactful spells, and then suddenly, you know, it's a lot less punishing for new players to play a deck like Kess because the cards are just really high card quality.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
And it's a deck you can play safe due to the flashback ability.
Mm-hmm.
And
yeah, you can maybe throw a little bit more caution to the wind with Kess. You're like, I'm going to go for it. And they'll be like, yeah, counterspell. You're like, I'm going to go for it again.
Yeah,
Kess, you know?
Exactly.
Yeah, and there's also, you know, you're going to see a lot of staples you saw in other formats in Kess. Like, at the time of this recording, Modern Horizons is new. It's playing things like Dragon's Rage Channeler. It's playing things like Dark Confidant. It's playing things like Dalthy Voidwalker, Ragavan. Ragavan's playing. It's playing a lot of these cards that you're seeing in other formats because they're just really, like you said, high efficient card quality, efficient cards. So you're not playing with a whole bunch of unknowns. You're playing with stuff that you've seen throughout the rest of your 60-card format career.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's another deck that scales really, really well. I mean, for anyone who knows around the space, and for those who aren't aware, Kree is a player who's been playing Kess midrange for a really long time, and I'm not sure, is Kree the author of the midrange primer?
Nope.
No, okay. But who, once again, another Mean 16 player, brought it to the top 4 of one of the tournaments in 2020. Solid player, knows how to pivot from, you know, the different metas that it existed in, because won a tournament during the Flash meta with it, and then proceeded to continue putting up results post Flash in this Adnos / the mid-range meta. So it's a deck that pivots really, really, really well. It can scale from a deck that you get introduced, as I said, in this sort of like, I understand Magic, but I don't know if I know cEDH space, and can scale all the way to, it's in arguably some of the best colors in this format, doing some really degenerate stuff,
Yep.
it can go at the top tables without a hesitation.
And one of the final pivots I would say that is also good is that as you play Kess, Kess can play on more than one axis. So you can play her as an Adnos strategy if you're really interested in doing the Adnos thing.
Yeah.
You can also play her as mid-range. You just play her as a mid-range strategy. You can also play her as a storm strategy.
Yeah.
Like she can pilot
There's a lot of
effectively on
options.
a lot of options. So she can adapt to you as a player as well. So you can start off with a basic list with a core that is usually in every Kess deck, and then kind of see which one you like more as you play it and you learn with it and you grow with it. So that's a really good part about Kess as well, in my opinion.
Sweet. So my last commander gives me a lot of reminiscence of Kess. It's got a lot of that same feel to it, and it could also easily be replaced on this list with Thrasios and Tymna midrange. But I think this one fits the first category a lot better, and it has a lot of historical sort of resonance with people. So I'm talking about Tasigur the Golden Fang. Now, Tasigur, I think, as I mentioned, it has a lot more either nostalgia, it has modern play. There's a lot of stuff to Tasigur that makes it just kind of beat out TNT midrange on this list for me. Just for the fact that people, so once again, modern players and legacy players play Tasigur. The Delve makes it a 1-mana 4/5 a good amount of the time, which is in a 20 life 1v1 format a very impactful body. And in cEDH it means I can do my degenerate stuff and then play a 1-mana 4/5 and that also happens to gain me a ridiculous amount of card advantage. I know a lot of players like it and will say at times that they think it's better than Thrasios and Tymna because of the ability to sculpt your own graveyard, because of the ability to say, hey, other player, and once again teaching you about table politics. Hey, other player, we're both about to die. If you don't give me this counterspell in my graveyard right now, we will lose this game. I'm going to activate Tasigur. Give me this so we don't die. And you get to learn about those interactions that are pretty unique to cEDH. And these are conversations that one can scale up from the casual level. But that idea of like, hey, I need you to stop him from comboing through me, the vessel. That's a pretty... it's not mimicked in a lot of formats, and Tasigur is a fantastic way to learn about those different subtleties of cEDH. It, once again, easy win conditions. Thassa's Oracle Demonic Consultation / Tainted Pact, easy, simple, we get how it works. Infinite mana with Isochron Scepter. We've already talked about how simple these A+B infinite mana outlets are. It's a very easy, digestible concept for people to learn. Historically speaking, I think there's a lot of reasons Tasigur is on this list. If we look back to early cEDH, we're talking about like the first couple videos from the Lab Maniacs, right?
And Team Turn 3, yep.
And Team Turn 3, like the seasons past Tasigur from Cameron was one of the most requested and talked about decks in the format from people trying to learn about it because it was cool. It had all these unique options to it. It had that grind power that people were like, wow, he's doing a lot of degenerate, silly things like going seasons past Palinchron. And now these are obviously things that are not in the current list for Tasigur, but this is the historical part of it, right? But also doing things like, having really powerful counter spells and using infinite mana outlets that are really clean and efficient. And it was really easy for people to grasp these things, right? And that's why Tasigur is just such a great option for newer players. It gives you black, it gives you blue, right? We talked about those two colors being super important in our format, and it gives you green, once again teaching you the idea of consistency with mana dorks and things like that, which also help with your Isochron Scepter packages. All of these things layer really well together with Tasigur. Now, a lot of people will talk about, Thrasios and Tymna maybe beating out Tasigur on a power level scale. And maybe if you're learning on Tasigur, guess what? That's a natural progression of an upgrade path for you. And at the same time, no one says that Tasigur can't compete at the highest levels. I think arguing that point would be kind of silly, especially because there's a lot of stuff coming out right now talking about, using cards like Sacrifice with Tasigur, using that to make 6 black mana, or using cards that we talked about before, like Neoform and Eldritch Evolution, getting big threats like Nezahal or, Razaketh. I've seen it before. I don't know. Coma. I know Rebel's actually really high on Coma as a threat off of Tasigur right now. So there's a lot of really cool stuff you can do with it that you can add that bit of flavor that it doesn't feel like I'm doing the full cEDH conversion. You can still have those things like, I'm going to turn my Tasigur into a Coma. Like I'm going to beat people to death with this big old serpent. And you can still learn about the format. You can learn about the fundamentals, about when to interact, when should I go for my combo. It gives you black to have really efficient tutors. You have blue for your counter magic. You have green for your consistency. Sultai is a really easy color combination to learn on. You don't have to worry about storming with things like Breach or Adnaz. There are Adnaz variants of Tasigur, which a great way to scale, right, is maybe going to these many different versions. And speaking of versions, Tasigur is probably one of the decks that exist in our format with like the most variance between the Brewer's Corner and the database, because people love Tasigur, and I think there's a reason that people pick it out of the crowd. It's got that modern appeal. It's got that old appeal. It's got that historic, still competitive appeal in 3 of the best colors in the format. Having blue-black, super important. Having really clean win conditions. It just does a lot of things, and it does a lot of them really well.
Tasigur is everything that you just mentioned. You basically hit all the points. It can be built 1,000 different ways.
Yeah.
Because there's never a day that you just don't want to get stuff and cast the same spell over and over and over again. It can be built as simply or as complex as you like. It can be built on a bunch of different axes. So if you want to do control, you want to do Turbonos, you want to do reanimator strategies with Razaketh, you can do all those. And like you said, it scales really well in a way that it's not that hard for a new player to grasp. So, like, when we talk about, running in the cEDH arenas, we're talking about things like interacting on the stack a lot and doing those types of things. Tasigur tells you, hey, you want to play Nezahal? Because you can play that in this format. Just play Tasigur and Neoform into it. They're like, wow, that's so cool. I love big, dumb creatures. The Timmy and me loves those. Great. Tasigur's for you. Because Tasigur does that kind of thing. And this allows you to scratch that itch or get into something that you like in a cEDH space that where you think that you might not have belonged. There is that, this is for the Spikes of the world. You Johnnies and Timmies, you Johnnies, you go down. You go to the battlecruiser sections. I think I'm getting those profiles right or wrong. I don't know. Anyway, the ones that love to play with the big, dumb creatures. They love to play with those quote-unquote big, dumb creatures. And you're like, hey, you want to cast Seasons Past? Like that's a crazy, like that's a commander card. Like, that's the expropriates of the world and stuff like that. Seasons Past is. No, that's a legit viable strategy in Tasigur. You can do that. And then you could do, and it does so many extra things too. Like I've lost a game once where Tasigur recurred, generated infinite mana, and then reality shifted all of our creatures. Then reality shifted all of the manifests and decked us that way. That was it was so good. It was such a cool thing, and it was just using their removal spell. Because it was reality shift. It was just a removal spell they were running anyway. And Tasigur allows you to do all these really cool things too. It also has the Thrasios benefit. You're always doing something. At the end of your turn before I go to mine, I'm going to return this this counterspell or this recursion piece or something. You're always doing something with Tasigur. You remove my Tasigur? No problem. I'll delve away and cast it for 1 again.
Exactly.
So it cheats that commander tax. It's always on the board kind of thing.
Sculpting your graveyard while you do that, by the way.
And playing politics which is a huge level up moment once again in cEDH, is that politics aspect that a lot of people don't think exists in the cEDH arena that absolutely does. They think that that's more of a casual thing and everyone's poker faced at cEDH, and that's not the case. We talk a lot.
Right.
I wouldn't play it if it was
my God.
that. That's not why I came to play. I came to have fun with my friends.
Well, those are the stressful tables. I don't like those tables at all.
Me neither. Those are for me. So.
But
so Tasigur is a fantastic commander.
Talking about that reality shift line, Tasigur is a really good way to introduce you to the concept of twister looping without twister looping, because the way that Tasigur works you can recur your spells infinitely, right? And you basically get to a point where you're forcing your opponents to give you the spells that you want. And that's what happens when you generate that infinite mana. And now your opponents are, basically forced in a position where you are recurring spells infinitely. And with something like Thrasios, obviously you'd have to draw until you get a Time Twister and then draw and then refill and then do all that stuff. And that makes Twister looping a lot more complicated. But Tasigur does it in a much more clean way. You get introduced to the concept that something like Reality Shift can be a win con without having to actually go through the process of learning how to Twister loop it the appropriate way.
Mm-hmm. And so Tasigur also teaches you to evaluate cards in new ways.
Yeah.
Your Reality Shift is no longer just your a removal spell for a problem creature. It's also a win con. Mm-hmm. So it might help you to remove what would otherwise be a dead card in your deck and free up a slot, because you're like, this is one of my win cons now. This is great.
Yeah, 100%. It's just a really solid list and some solid colors, and teaches you some really clean win conditions. And I think it, along with Kess and maybe Dawnwaker, that very much, couple colors, really clean stuff gets you to your wins.
Yep. One last thing I want to talk about with Tasigur is something that not all the lists have been able to do as well. This is one of the premier commanders that you can inject your personality into. Like this one's a big one for that. If
100%.
Representation of yourself at your table with things like your playmat and your sleeves and your deck goes, Tasigur is one of the best to do that at a cEDH table. You can build Tasigur a number of different ways, but there is no problem with putting a pet card in there, in Tasigur. There's nothing wrong with doing that. That's where all the Tasigur builds came from. Yeah. People putting their personalities into Tasigur, and it still ended up being viable because it was Tasigur. Yeah. Like you said, we chuckled. We said, ha ha ha, Coma. Coma, that was somebody injecting their personality into it. Yeah. Or Nezahal, there's no way Nezahal can be a cEDH card. Be like, well, no maximum hand size, can't be countered, non-creature spells equals cards. This is actually really good if we can get it out there.
Yep.
And then, sure enough, Tasigur allows you to do that. Mm-hmm. So these, what would normally be relegated for the Battlecruiser tables, now playing in cEDH tables, is a good way to have representation of yourself, your self-expression. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And Tasigur... we're not even done brewing with Tasigur. Every time new cards come out in this color, there is all of a sudden a new opportunity that has opened up with Tasigur again. Yeah. And we see that all the time still going around. Mm-hmm. I still see builds of Tasigur out in the wild that are none of the decks on the database, of which there are 10 Tasigurs out there right now in the database. Yeah, there's so many Tasigurs, which is a great thing, because you can build them so many different ways.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And that wraps it up for our last new player deck for today. Now, if you're at home and you're wondering, why didn't you mention X, Y, or Z deck? One, there's a chance that it's in the show notes, which our patrons get exclusive access to. And two, we'd love to hear from you guys at home. Are there any decks that you guys didn't hear about today that you are 100% sure new players should start on? Do you want to even make suggestions for when we do the budget episode? Talk about your own experiences as a new player. Are there any lists that you started on that you think are really interesting and that really helped you grow as a player? We'd love to hear about all of those things down in the comments below, because we love that conversation. We love to learn more, and through conversations like that, we can all grow as players. The more information is out there, the more people who check the comments of videos like this and see new decks to let their friends use, let people at their own LGS use, the better cEDH becomes, because more people are there, more variety in games. The more people are playing the format, the better off the format will be.
And this definitely wasn't any sort of de facto, these are the only new player decks and you can only ever play these if you're a new player. We definitely don't want that to be the conveyed message today. Yeah. There are a ton of different decks out there that you can play. And you know what? You are absolutely free and welcome to disregard everything we said and go play a super complicated list. Yeah. That's fine. We know that there are times when you as an enfranchised player might want to introduce somebody, and you know that person because they're your friend and you play with them at your LGS or at your kitchen table, and you say, this person really likes to play these big crazy spells. Maybe you're right, Tasigur might be good. I didn't think about Tasigur before. I was going to put him on some Grixis pile, and that probably wouldn't have been the best experience for him.
Exactly.
And also tell us about your experiences. Was there a time when you handed somebody a deck and they didn't have a good experience, or they did have a really good one and you're just like, hey, this is what got them into it. This is what sealed the deal. We'd love to hear that type of feedback too. That stuff, I live for those types of comments, seeing those types of things happening in the wild. And this also helps make our show better as well. We love to get that new experience so we just don't end up in an echo chamber of only our own personal experiences.
Oh my God, that's so true.
That can happen. So. All right, so a big thanks again to all of our sponsors. That's TCG Player, that is Dragon Shield, and that is the support from viewers and listeners like you over on Patreon. If you're watching this on YouTube, give us a comment, like the video, subscribe if you're not already a subscriber. Tell us how you feel about these intro decks. Are they good? Are they bad? Are they something else? Have a different recommendation? Let us know. Make sure if you're listening on your favorite podcast aggregator, give us a review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, whatever one that you're using. That also helps spread the message of the show as well. You can also find us on Twitter and Facebook. Hang out with us there on social media. If you sign up to our Patreon, you can also get onto our Discord where we chat with our members all day long. We have a great time memeing and putting out low quality posts all day long. It's a lot of fun. We absolutely love it. So all the links for everything we talked about tonight and the links for what I just said now is all in the description below.
And if you watch this episode and you're like, hey, that Dawnwaker Thrasios list is pretty cool. I wish I could see a YouTube channel from the person who made that list. You're like, whoa, that exists? Check out youtube.com/comedianmtg. You can find my personal channel, talk about things like new brews, decks like Winota and Dawnwaker Thrasios brewed and talked about on that channel before they were ever made on the cEDH decklist database. I also go over things like top fours from big tournaments, hearing about decks that you guys don't hear often, but are somehow performing well and putting up numbers. All of those things you can find out, once again, youtube.com/comedianmtg. And that wraps it up for this episode of the podcast. Tune in next time when we talk about our favorite format and our favorite game, Magic the Gathering. Thank you so much for watching and listening, and we'll see you next time.